My name is Natalie Brooks. I am 34 years old, and I'm from Seattle, Washington. I lost my husband, but what my parents tried to take from me afterward hurt even more. Have you ever buried the love of your life, and then realized the real battle was just beginning? What would you do if, while you were still grieving, your own parents filed paperwork calling you mentally unfit? Not because they were worried, not because they cared, but because there was $4 million on the line. Would you crumble? Would you scream? Or would you stay quiet and gather proof so airtight that when the truth exploded in court, nobody could deny it? Stay with me, because what they didn't know is I had already prepared for this war. 2 weeks. That's how long I had between burying my husband and being served legal papers by my own parents. 14 days after I stood beside a polished wooden casket, holding white roses that didn't even smell real, I opened my front door thinking it was another sympathy bouquet. Instead, it was a process server, neutral face, professional tone. You've been served. At first, I didn't understand what I was holding. My brain was still foggy from sleepless nights and forced condolences. But when I saw the words petition for guardianship and mental incompetence, my hands started shaking. They were asking the court to declare me mentally unfit, not quietly, not privately, legally. Have you ever read something so cruel your body reacts before your mind can? My ears rang. My chest tightened. I had just lost my husband, my partner, my best friend, the man I built a life with, and now the people who raised me were trying to prove I couldn't manage my own. The timing wasn't accidental. They waited until I was visibly exhausted, until I'd cried in public, until I'd canceled meetings and ignored calls. They documented my grief like it was evidence of instability. Therapy appointments became mental fragility. Panic attacks after identifying my husband's body became emotional volatility. They weaponized my mourning, and the most calculated part. The petition mentioned my late husband's $4 million estate multiple times. It framed it as complex assets requiring stable oversight. They positioned themselves as the responsible solution, as if they were reluctantly stepping in for my own good. But here's what hit me hardest. They didn't call me unstable when I helped my husband review investment contracts. They didn't question my judgment when I co-managed property renovations. They didn't doubt my mind when I signed business paperwork beside him for years. No, they only questioned me once he was gone. Once the money was solely in my name, that's when grief suddenly became a diagnosis. I replayed the past few weeks in my head. The way my mother insisted I rest while she asked detailed questions about account access. The way my father offered to temporarily oversee things until I felt stronger. At the time, I thought it was care. Now I saw it clearly. It was positioning. And here's the part that changed everything for me. They assumed grief made me weak, but grief doesn't just break you. Sometimes it burns everything unnecessary away. It leaves clarity. It forces you to see people without emotional filters. That night, instead of collapsing, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by unopened sympathy cards and read every page of that petition slowly. Line by line, I highlighted every exaggeration, every fabricated concern, every strategic phrase. I cried, but I didn't crumble. Because the moment they tried to legally erase my competence, they stopped being my parents in that situation. They became opponents, and if they wanted a legal battle, they were about to learn something important. I might have been grieving, I might have been exhausted, but I was not unfit. You know what hurts more than being called unstable? Being called unstable by people who know exactly what you've survived. In their petition, my parents didn't submit a medical diagnosis. They didn't attach psychiatric evaluations. There was no doctor declaring me incompetent. Instead, they built something far more dangerous, a narrative. They described me as emotionally compromised. They wrote that I was displaying erratic financial judgment. They claimed I was isolating and irrational. On paper, it looked concerning. In reality, it was grief. I had started therapy after my husband died, voluntarily, proactively, because I didn't want to drown in the silence of our home. Somehow, that became proof I couldn't function. Tell me something. Since when does asking for help mean you're incapable? They twisted ordinary moments into symptoms. The day I broke down crying in my mother's kitchen. Emotional instability. The weekend, I ignored phone calls because I couldn't stop staring at our wedding photos. Withdrawal behavior. The time I postponed a financial meeting because I hadn't slept in 48 hours. Impaired decision-making. They were building a case brick by brick, using my most human reactions against me. But here's what they didn't know about me. I document everything. It started years ago when my husband and I were building his business portfolio. Contracts, negotiations, investment calls, details mattered, so I kept emails. I saved texts. I organized files. Not because I expected betrayal, but because structure brings peace. And patterns reveal truth. When I went back through months of messages, something clicked. Long before the petition was filed, my parents were planting seeds. My father texting, "Handling this much money alone can overwhelm anyone." My mother saying during dinner, "You've always been sensitive." Stress doesn't help your mental state. At the time, those words felt protective. Now they felt strategic. Then I found the email that made my stomach drop. It was from my mother to a distant relative, forwarded accidentally during a group thread about funeral arrangements. In it, she wrote, "We may need to step in if Natalie spirals. It's better if we control things before outsiders do." Before outsiders do. Control. That word echoed louder than anything else. They weren't concerned about my mental health. They were concerned about losing access. And the more I reviewed their statements in the petition, the clearer it became. They relied on assumptions, not evidence. Emotional language, not clinical facts. They expected the court to see a grieving widow and assume fragility. But grief is not insanity. Pain is not incompetence. And therapy is not a diagnosis. The most shocking discovery came when my attorney requested medical documentation to support their claims. There was none. No psychiatric hold. No cognitive evaluation. No professional recommendations suggesting guardianship. Just their sworn testimony. Opinion disguised as concern. That's when I realized something powerful. They were counting on perception, not proof. They believed if they repeated mentally unfit enough times, it would stick. But I had something stronger than their accusations. I had timelines. I had financial records showing I continued paying taxes, managing investments, signing documents accurately. I had therapist statements confirming I was grieving, but cognitively sound. And most importantly, I had their own words. Because when someone tries to create a diagnosis that doesn't exist, the truth isn't loud. It's documented. Let's stop pretending this was about my mental health. It was. It was about $4 million. My husband didn't inherit that money, he built it. Late nights, calculated risks, smart investments, rental properties, a diversified portfolio, life insurance. Everything structured carefully, legally, transparently. And when he passed, every asset transferred exactly as planned. To me, no shared control, no co-signers, no parental oversight, just me. And that's when the tone shifted. Before the funeral flowers even wilted, my father started asking unusually specific questions. Are the accounts solely in your name now? Do you know how to handle capital gains taxes? Who's advising you? At first, it sounded helpful, responsible, even, but the frequency increased. The urgency sharpened. Then my mother began suggesting I move back home, temporarily. She said it would be easier if they handled property management while I focused on healing. She brought up hiring a financial advisor, someone she already trusted, someone connected to her friend's firm. Convenient. Have you ever noticed how quickly people volunteer to carry your burden when your burden is worth millions? Here's the part that sealed it for me. During a family dinner, just days before I was served, my father casually said, "Large estates can disappear fast without strong oversight." Oversight. There it was again, that coded language. Not support, not partnership, control. I started reviewing numbers out of instinct. I logged into every account, nothing missing, nothing altered. But I noticed something else. My parents had recently asked for copies of certain documents for safekeeping. They wanted statements, trust structures, policy details. Why would they need that? Because you can't plan to control something you don't understand. And here's what hurt the most. They underestimated me financially. They assumed my husband handled everything alone. That I was just the emotional partner, not the strategic one. They forgot I sat beside him during negotiations. I read contracts. I questioned clauses. I helped choose property locations. I knew the difference between long-term equity growth and short-term liquidity traps. They saw a grieving widow. They didn't see a woman who understood her own balance sheet. When my attorney later analyzed their guardianship petition, he pointed something out I'll never forget. In their filing, they emphasized the complexity of the estate more than my supposed instability. Paragraph after paragraph about asset management challenges, investment risks, fiduciary responsibility. It read less like concern about my mental state and more like a pitch to manage wealth. And the truth is simple: $4 million changes people. It exposes priorities. It reveals entitlement. It tempts even those who claim moral superiority. My parents weren't drowning in debt. They weren't struggling. But they had always believed money should stay within proper hands. Apparently, mine weren't proper enough. But here's what they miscalculated. They thought the estate was the prize. It was. The real power was ownership, autonomy, independence. If they controlled the money, they controlled my future decisions, where I lived, what I invested in, who I trusted. This wasn't about helping me heal. It was about positioning themselves at the head of a financial throne they didn't build. And once I saw the motive clearly, the guilt disappeared. Because you can forgive ignorance. You can forgive fear. But when someone tries to reframe greed as protection, that's when the game changes. I never planned to build a case against my own parents. That's the part people don't understand. The recordings, the saved voicemails, the archived emails, none of it started as insurance. It started as habit, organization, structure. The kind of discipline you develop when you're married to someone who treats documentation like oxygen. My husband used to say, "If it's important, record it. If it's said, confirm it in writing." I didn't know those habits would one day protect me from my own family. The first piece of evidence wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. A voicemail from my mother, 3 days after the funeral. Her voice was soft, concerned. "Natalie, sweetheart, you don't sound like yourself. I'm worried you might not be thinking clearly. Maybe we should talk about putting temporary safeguards in place, just until you're stable." Stable, that word again. At the time, I saved it because something about her tone felt rehearsed. Not loving, measured. Then there was a dinner conversation at their house. I had placed my phone face down on the table, recording a voice memo for myself because I'd been tracking expenses earlier. I forgot it was still running. What it captured changed everything. My father said, casually, "If we move quickly, the court will see she's overwhelmed." Judges don't like financial risk attached to emotional instability. My mother responded, "We just have to frame it as protection." Frame it, protection, not concern, not support, strategy. When I listened back to that audio days later, my stomach dropped. They weren't reacting to my grief. They were anticipating how to leverage it. And then came the email thread. My father accidentally copied me on a message, intended for his attorney friend. In it, he wrote, "If we petition before she regains composure, it strengthens the argument." Before she regains composure. He was timing my pain. That's when everything shifted inside me. Up until then, part of me still hoped this was misunderstanding. Fear, overreaction, but evidence doesn't lie. It reveals intention. I didn't collect those pieces to attack them. I collected them because something in my instincts kept whispering, "Pay attention." So I organized everything. Dates, transcripts, screenshots, voicemails converted into written form. Not emotional reactions, facts. When I handed the folder to my attorney, he sat silently for nearly 5 minutes reading. Then he looked up and said something I'll never forget. "They're not questioning your mental health. They're constructing a narrative." That word again. Narrative. and narratives fall apart under documentation. The most powerful piece wasn't even the recordings. It was the timeline. Their private discussions about guardianship began before they ever claimed I was unstable. Before any supposed erratic behavior, before any dramatic breakdown, they decided the conclusion first, then they searched for symptoms, and here's the irony. They thought I was too fragile to notice, too emotional to prepare, too broken to defend myself, but pain doesn't erase intelligence, it sharpens observation. By the time the court date approached, I wasn't walking in with accusations. I was walking in with proof I never wanted to use, because sometimes the strongest weapon isn't anger, it's receipts. The morning of the hearing, I woke up before my alarm, not because I was anxious, because I was ready. There's a different kind of calm that settles in when you know the truth is documented. It's not loud, it doesn't tremble, it just sits steady in your chest. When I walked into the courthouse, my parents were already there, dressed sharp, confident. My mother avoided eye contact. My father nodded at me like this was a business meeting. That told me everything. They didn't see this as betrayal, they saw it as strategy. Inside the courtroom, their attorney spoke first. He painted a careful picture: grieving widow, emotional fragility, financial complexity, concerned parents stepping in to prevent irreversible mistakes. He used polished language. Protective oversight, temporary guardianship, financial stewardship. It sounded almost noble. If I didn't know the backstory, I might have believed it myself. Then my attorney stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't attack their character. He simply said, "Your Honor, before we address claims of mental incompetence, we would like to submit documented communications that clarify intent." Intent. The word hung in the air. The first exhibit was the timeline, showing their guardianship discussions began days after my husband's death, before any alleged instability. Then came financial records proving I had consistently managed assets responsibly, tax payments on time, property expenses handled, investment accounts untouched. No erratic withdrawals. No reckless transfers, no chaos. Then the audio transcript was submitted. You could feel the shift in the room when the judge read the line, "If we move quickly, the court will see she's overwhelmed." My father's posture stiffened. My mother's hands tightened in her lap. Their attorney flipped through papers faster, and for the first time, they weren't looking at me with concern. They were looking at me with surprise, because the narrative was cracking. When my therapist's written statement was read aloud, confirming I was grieving but cognitively sound, the word unfit started to lose oxygen. It no longer had weight. It had motive behind it. The judge asked a simple question that changed everything. "Can you provide medical documentation diagnosing incompetence?" Silence. Not emotional silence. Legal silence. Their attorney cleared his throat. "No formal diagnosis, Your Honor. The petition was precautionary." Precautionary. The courtroom air felt different now. Not tense, clarified. The judge leaned back, reviewing the evidence again. Then he said words I'll never forget. "Grief is not grounds for guardianship." Just like that, their petition was dismissed. But the real shift wasn't the ruling. It was the realization settling over my parents' faces. They hadn't just lost control of the estate, they had exposed their intentions in public record. They had shown the court, and me, exactly what they were willing to do for access to money. When we walked out of that courtroom, they tried to speak. I didn't stop. Because here's what they never understood. This was never about revenge. It was about boundaries. They thought I was the weakest version of myself. But when you survive loss, betrayal, and public accusation, and you walk out standing, you don't just win a case, you reclaim your power. If this story hit you in the chest, I need you to pause for a second. How many people are told they're too emotional when they're just grieving? How many are labeled unstable when they're simply hurting? And how many stay silent because the accusation comes from family? If you've ever had someone try to control you by questioning your sanity, this channel is for you. Drop a "I am not crazy" in the comments if you believe grief is not weakness. Hit like if you think manipulation disguised as protection is the worst kind of betrayal. And subscribe, because these stories aren't just drama, they're lessons in power, boundaries, and standing up when it matters most. Trust me, the next story, it might hit even closer to home.